And what I'm going to do is, I think the general ways, I will ask each of our panelists a question and then a general question and follow up from there, and hopefully there may be time for audience questions. Let me go to my dear, dear friend, the Deputy Undersecretary, Thea Lee. You were engaged in the NAFTA fight. Yes, in the early 1990s. You wrote about how a trade agreement model that placed corporate interests first had, and I quote, hidden costs for workers. Now we are 30 years later. We've seen several other significant changes to the global trade order, the formation of the WTO, the granting of permanent normal trade relations to China, and many other free trade agreements. What has been, in your view, the outcome of corporate trade models for working people and for the U.S. economic resilience writ large? What has been the result of all of this?
Well, thank you so much, Rosa, and what a pleasure to be here with Lori Wallach and Scott Paul, two titans of the trade debate. So this is a great pleasure. But, you know, we were there in the early 1990s. I was working at the Economic Policy Institute at the time. And, you know, the premise was, should trade agreements be just for corporations? Should they be just for multinational corporations to have more power and more wealth and more flexibility and more mobility than they already had? Or were there other considerations at stake? And, you know, at the end of the day, I think we were proven right.
Amen.
I don't always like to say, you know, I told you so, but we did. We told them so.
Exactly.
And the outcome was job loss in the millions. I mean, not just from NAFTA, but from the China PNTR and from the other trade agreements, that we hollowed out our manufacturing sector. We hollowed out communities across the United States of America. And we had a complete rupture of resilient supply chains. And we saw that particularly during COVID, where all of a sudden, like who knew, we couldn't make ventilators, we couldn't make personal protective equipment, and we were dependent on a somewhat hostile trading partner, China, to deliver things that we needed for our lives, for our life existence. And now we're seeing also the same kind of thing with respect to clean energy supply chains, where we made through corporate globalization, some kind of short-sighted choices maybe 10 years ago, like, hey, let's just buy it cheaper from China. Who needs to produce things here in the United States of America? And now we are finding that those supply chains are fatally tainted with forced labor in many cases, with actual slave labor. Mm-hmm. And we are faced with this horrible choice. Are we supposed to continue with deployment of solar panels and electric vehicles at the cost of slave labor, or do we have to stop and think back again? And, you know, this administration is going in the other direction. But so the outcomes were atrocious in terms of the manufacturing sector and our ability to produce. But it wasn't just the number of jobs, it was the quality of jobs. That good quality unionized manufacturing jobs were lost, and they weren't replaced with very much. And if you think about it, it was really by design. This was corporate power, corporate ambition and overreach, that they glommed onto the idea of the trade agreement, and NAFTA was kind of the embodiment of all of that. And they used it to further an agenda of anti-regulation, anti-taxation, anti-union, anti-environment policies. And so they fundamentally undercut democracy. And that is, I think, why we were able to build a really powerful coalition. It was a multinational coalition. It wasn't us against Mexico or against Canada. It was worker activists, environmentalists, civil society activists, human rights activists in Mexico and Canada and the United States coming together. And over time, I think that really served us well, because that's why we always had a vision of what trade agreements could be, or what trade policy could be, that was not just about maximizing profits and corporate power. But if we think about it, of course, in today's conference, it's about shifting the balance of bargaining power. That there is already an inherent imbalance of power between employers and workers. You know, the employers have the capital, they own the factory, the workers have their own labor to offer. And when you think about taking globalization on top of that, you can magnify it 1,000 times. So now you take a multinational corporation, one of the wealthiest entities in the world, and you put it against a worker who might be illiterate, who came out of the rural areas, who's never held a job before, doesn't know what their rights are. And that tremendous imbalance of power is exactly what corporations were looking to, that it wasn't good enough for them. That in the United States of America they'd already beaten back unions, that they'd already taken away a lot of jobs. They wanted more power. They wanted the power to go and to force governments to compete with each other for the scraps of the global economy. Whether developing country governments, desperate for jobs, desperate for foreign investment, having to offer up weaker regulation, less taxes, busted unions in order to attract investment. So, at the end of the day, if you contrast what was in NAFTA and the trade agreements of that era with what was not in, I think you see a very clear picture. So there were strong protections for intellectual property rights, for pharmaceutical companies, for copyrights, as you said, Rosa. There were strong protections in terms of financial flows, that the big money corporations needed to be able to move their money around without any barriers, without any hiccups. And, of course, the investor-state dispute settlement, which empowered individual foreign investors to sue governments over regulations they didn't like. And I'm sure Laurie will talk a little bit more about that. And then on the other side, you see almost nothing for labor and environment. So the labor and environmental side agreements were so pathetic and weak. We at the AFL-CIO, I ended up at the AFL-CIO, tried to use those agreements for a couple of decades, but there was no dispute settlement. There was no remedy at the end of the day. So you can spend tens of thousands of dollars getting the workers to testify, showing some egregious abuses of workers' rights that were happening in Mexico with American companies or multinational companies, and at the end of the day, there were no teeth to it. And that was by design. So, it was just the contrast between weaponizing the market access. And if you think about it this way, the corporations were selling off access to the U.S. consumer market to the highest bidder. And they were doing it in a way and on terms that were uniquely favorable to multinational corporations and uniquely damaging to worker power, to environmental protections, even to consumer protections, because they got the governments of the global South and the labor movements and the activists to have to compete for scraps while they strengthened and embedded their own protections and trying to reduce the risk of outsourcing by locking in market access, locking in low tariffs, locking in investor protections that had not existed before and don't exist in any democratic government, and then forcing governments to compete by keeping taxes low, keeping regulations weak, not enforcing labor protections, and busting unions. So that was the end of the day. It was a sad picture, but I know we're going to go to a brighter place as this conversation evolves. Thank you, Rosa.
Well, thank you, Thea. Excellent, excellent.